Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Indrek Ibrus. I'm a professor of media innovation in Tallinn University Baltic Film, Media and Art School. So the backstory of this, my today's talk is actually quite long, and I will introduce it again slightly later, but I guess the bottom line, the main fact is that I've been doing this research that I'm going to tell you today about for many years now, at least 4 years, actually more, 5 years, very slowly next to my other things, and then I've been collecting the data for very long. And so I don't even remember if my title says something about evolution. So in this sense, it's also evolution, because it's a very slow tracing of what's actually happening in the audiovisual culture, the audiovisual datafication of audiovisual culture and audiovisual industries. How does that happen? So I've been doing it over time. So I actually have some sort of a story to tell. But let's kickstart this. I'm going to share my slides. There it goes. I hope I assume you can see it all. The backstory is that I had a grant to study how metadata standards are evolving, and what are their potential effects on cultural memory in a broader sense. And what should I do to make my slides move? 1 second. Aha, they do move. I've been doing this, and in some sense, definitely the project is still ongoing. So although I sort of carried out most of the analysis this summer, I realized also that I'm missing something. So I need to continue doing it a little more, a couple of months more. I need to do some more interviews with relevant audiovisual industry stakeholders. But what we have been doing, or I did it together with my collaborator Mario Ojamaa a couple of years ago. So we did do, next to what I'm going to tell you about, we did do some theoretical work as well as kind of analytic work to understand how metadata mediates history, kind of participates in a sort of mediation and formation of cultural memory, what people can access actually when they are searching different archives, and thus what do they find and what do they reuse as audiovisual industry professionals, or as teachers, for instance, teachers using archives to teach history to students. So we kind of have been demonstrating in various ways that metadata has a role in that. Metadata mediates memory. Metadata participates in cultural memory formation in the societies. But what I've been doing next to this is, as I've been kind of already hinting several times, is doing interviews with audiovisual industry in the broader sense stakeholders. Yes, in focusing on power struggles. And so what do I mean by with this focus? Oh, okay, I'm going to first tell you about them, sort of my methods, and then I'm going to go back to the conceptual issues. Why to do this kind of research? So what I've been doing is interviews with European and Northern American stakeholders, 30 interviews, plus a bunch of industry podcasts, and plus documentary research, so reading all sorts of white papers, standards documents, discussion boards on these issues. So, and the stakeholders are various kinds of film archives, broadcasters, standard developers, and public and private institutions. So not only, yes, the European public broadcasters, but for instance, HBO and other private broadcasters and industry institutions. What I'm still lacking are platforms, and this is what I'm going to need to pursue now very quickly. And what I could have also more is different MAM vendors, so MAM are media asset management systems that broadcasters mainly use in their operations. Yes, so basically in the next couple of months, I aim to do some more interviews, especially with these private industry stakeholders, MAM vendors, as well as big platforms. Plus actually a couple of broadcasters as well, because I've been realizing that some newcomers have been coming to this standard game, but I'm going to tell you more about this in the next minutes. So, okay, to the conceptual part. So I do have a history in standardization studies. So standardization studies have been emerged sort of late 80s, early 90s in the context of, within the broader framework of innovation studies. So the understanding was that that's sort of digitization then, late 80s, early 90s started to happen. The realization was quick that, hey, that standards are absolutely central when it comes to institutions collaborating, forming, so to speak, innovation systems. Innovation systems are effectively various kinds of, so basically industries collaborating, forming value chains, and thus kind of facilitating innovations in each other, and thus kind of contributing to the GDP growth in various countries. So the understanding was that for the sort of economic growth and innovation to happen, so standardization, especially in the sort of era of digitization, have a central role. And people started studying this, in the context of the broader studies of innovation systems, and especially what emerged at the time was that yes, societies are governed by laws and regulations, but they are increasingly also governed by technological standards. And in this sense, technological standard is a kind of complex issue, because a lot of standardization is done by private industries, so they are outside of the control of public institutions. And so there's always the question of if standards always serve the sort of the public good or public interest. And my own first attempt to study standardization was part of my PhD research, where I studied the emergence of 3G related. When the 3G mobile connectivity arrived, then also mobile web as a kind of new platform for services and content formats, etc., started to emerge. And thus I studied, my own PhD was kind of studying this standardization of the mobile web as a kind of important avenue of industry power struggles. Different kinds of industries, sub-industries had very different kinds of ideas what the mobile web should be like. And for instance, in that context, there was a big issue of, if anything is under the control of public institutions, or what is the public interest at all in this context. A big important case here in case of the question of public interest is W3C, the core so web standardization body, where in terms of by definition, everybody can contribute to and can take part of. But of course, it's mainly driven by the big platforms who have big pockets to really work on the standardization, and of course they are the influential and thriving institutions at these tables. Of course, and societies generally, I mean, governments are more focusing on internet standardization. So core internet protocol. And of course, those of you who know about this internet standardization long-term process know how big of and complex power struggle this has been. Now, but I'm not going to go into that. So, but of course, the focus is on how societies are governed by technological standards, and then secondly, who has the power to standardize, and what does that mean when it comes to technological continuities being created by standards and by standardization processes? Then who benefits for these kinds of continuities, who are not benefiting, and so basically whose interests the standards are always serving. Are they always serving the public interest? Is it when is it time to standardize? When it's time to leave the kind of field still open, and so that everybody can innovate, etc., etc. So basically, these are the kind of issues that standardization studies I've been dealing with since early 90s. And I think it's one book cover there, so basically from the 1995. That kind of perhaps consolidated this field a little. Okay, my own conceptual focus has been, if you noticed in my title was the term dialogues. But this is something that I did already for my PhD, that I was interested in how various kinds of institutions are in dialogue when standards evolve, because there are kind of official standardization processes. People are meeting at tables or specific discussion fora and are setting their standards, but there is a lot of kind of around the corner market kind of indirect standardization. So basically market competition in which process, so different stakeholders are reacting to each other's actions and gradually are kind of approving certain kind of technological solutions as de facto standards. And once de facto standards have been arrived at, there's always probably then the next step is arriving at the de jure standards. So something actually codified formally. So yeah, and I've been already mentioning that I introduced this standardization in the context of broader innovation studies and especially innovation system studies. So again, innovation systems are coming together various kinds of institutional stakeholders who all have some sort of, who form value chains of various kinds, who are part of the same economic ecosystem. And when the sort of innovation system is well coordinated, so to speak, institutions are exchanging knowledge resources, other kinds of resources, are interacting with each other, kind of facilitating each other's growth. Then the system is well coordinated. Then the question is again, what is the role of standard in this kinds of innovation system development, and does this innovation system development actually translate into public wealth or public well-being? Okay, in practice, so I have, in some sense, you can say that this focus on dialogues, indirect dialogues, direct dialogues, innovation system formation, I'm already kind of conceptually framed. But at the same time, when I approached this topic of audiovisual metadata standards, then I didn't really have a clear hypothesis. So in some sense, you can also say that it was kind of part-grounded theory, in a sense that I just ventured to this field to figure out what's happening. So I didn't have a clear hypothesis of how things are. In some sense, I could speak hours about this whole topic, what's been happening, and there's a lot of details. So what I'm going to present you today is this kind of broad brush results, which I can mention already that the plan is to publish it in at least three different academic articles. That's in some sense quite a lot to tell. And maybe we can come to these details in the discussion section afterwards. So, the very kind of first conclusion is that my hypothesis was right at the beginning. And the hypothesis is that, I just said I didn't have a hypothesis, but I had one. I had one, which is that metadata matters. in a sense that, well, I'm a media scholar in the first place. I do semiotics and innovation studies, etc., but my field is media. And media, in media studies, we are generally, as a field, we are absolutely obsessed with algorithms. Yeah, there are algorithm studies and platform studies of all kinds, and very nice. A lot of kind of critical studies have been carried out in different corners of our field when studying different kinds of platforms and how the algorithms are operating and how they're affecting what kind of content can we access and what kind of content we tend to access and what do we tend to do on those platforms. Now, when it comes to audiovisual culture, algorithms are operating with something, with content. And of course, they don't interact with content directly, they operate with metadata. And the sort of quick conclusion about audiovisual industry metadata or sector metadata is that it's typically a mess. So this is why we cannot have nice things, so to speak. This is why the Netflix recommendation engine never tends to work, or YouTube or what have you, because you don't have a proper good quality metadata. For various reasons. One reason is it cannot be good ever, because metadata is always a summary. Any summary, any sort of conclusive representation is a bit of a lie, and the distortion is already in there, and thus it cannot be perfect. But okay, I'm going to go back to sort of how. I'm going to come back to how metadata is a mess, so to speak, but and why. But basically, of course, when I say metadata standards, so of course, in some sense, a standard also needs to be defined. So what is a standard? I can say that there are thousands of standards in this area. There are various kinds of in-house standards. There are standards for all kinds of small operations that the industry is doing. There are tens of standards for every little thing. Let's say news exchange, so how newsrooms are exchanging news stories. There are tens of standards only for that, yeah, for how to exchange the news stories. So again, the complexity is very high. And at the same time, there are kind of, when we try to do this kind of meta discussion about what's kind of happening in the broader industry, then certain standards tend to emerge in the talk of people. So first is being EBU core and its close relative PV core in the US context. And then EN 15907, which is the film cataloging film archive standard. And then FIAF, which is the Federation of Film Archives Cataloging Manual. But again, thousands of others, and there are many important other names in this game. But I can already tell you that the driving discussion really is about the linked data. So how and why should different institutions do the transfer towards over the RDF, so Resource Description Framework, which is the core linked data standard. So okay, so what I'm going to do now is tell you, as I said, broad brush results. So I'm going to tell you different kinds of institution types. So what kind of emerged when I talk to them, and what are they what drives them when they do when they either standardize themselves or adopt different kind of standards or adapt different kind of standards. So there's a lot of adoption, but then also a lot of adaptation. So different modifications are happening. So as I said, we tend to think about this, that everything in the audiovisual industry is driven by audience data, that everybody's collecting this, but film archives certainly are not. Whenever you ask them about, do they collect any user data, any, then there's next to nothing. They don't do that. They always say, oh yeah, maybe we should, but they don't. So typically film archives are, of course, public institutions in all countries, also in Europe. So what are they interested when they are either adopting standards or developing some solutions? Is their core motivation is to manage complexity in terms of different versions of films and in different paradoxes. So paradox meaning text about text related to film. So scripts, posters, information about actors, filmmakers, all that. Yeah, reception, so reviews of films and so on and so forth. But the versions are also very important. We don't know, but any film archivists know that there are typically tens and tens of versions of the same film. There are different localization versions, different because different countries have different legal systems, so they tend to different, especially in this back in time, they needed to adopt the different, let's say, legal systems, their films. Of course, adaptations have been happening because of television formats and all that. So, so they typically have lots of versions. Everything is valuable because archives are oriented to historic, so basically recording the history. So they need to have those versions. Also, in case of documentary films, especially, you have different cultural contexts. Let's say different language versions, different place names are in different languages. Yeah, so there is a lot of kind of data that have versions, alternative versions. So they need to manage that complexity. And so at the same time, they are public institutions. They are typically very poor. They don't have lots of funds. They need to be very effective in terms of what they're doing. And so the core problem tends to be that they have made some, at some point in the history, some decisions in terms of their database solutions. Sometimes these database solutions are proprietary. So they are then dependent on those MAM providers, so to speak, and their standards. And so they kind of innovate on their own. Every change costs a lot of money, and they cannot get the data out to share with others effectively. So, and here in this context, very clearly, there's been emerging the motivation to go over them, to start using the linked data formats. For one reason is that it is a way to save money. It's an open standard, and yeah, so you can get out of that basically that dependence from the proprietary vendors, etc. Secondly, you can cut costs by starting sharing information. So let's say that you are Belgian film archive, and you are operating there in the middle of Europe. You probably have had over the decades lots of contacts with let's say other cultures. Yeah, so you're in your archive, you're having lots of films from other countries, and you don't have that much of information about those films. Developing that method, acquiring or developing that metadata would be extremely labor intensive. You don't have these funds, but what if you could actually just connect to those Italian archives more easily? So this is why it's a clear motivation again for that linked data model, because then you could simply link to the other databases, in Italy, wherever you are. So wherever they are, and this, I'm not mentioning the Belgian case just by accident, because the Royal Film Archive Cinematheek in Belgium has been a driving force in Europe when it comes to that transfer, but they are by far not the only ones anymore. So there is this, and of course there is also in this context this complexity management and version management, because linked data structures would kind of enable this more easily. So you can just have, add extra link about this version or that version, or some paratext, etc., etc. Of course, in here needs to be mentioned that this EN 15907 was designed. It's a quite new standard. Was designed for managing that complexity in terms of versions. However, it is still quite a kind of close standard, but still in this context, there is this discussion of, hey, we just had a new standard. We are all still managing or trying to go over that as film archives, but now there is this explosion when it comes to the semantic web standards. So these are the internal discussions and processes in the film archive world. Now, broadcasters. Broadcasters are different, very importantly, from film archives, broadcasting archives, because effectively their core service is not to serve, the core purpose is not to serve the public, but their in-house workflows. So archives are meant to be at the hands of new content, are part of the new content production as providing archive content to them. But of course, archives are only one element of the game. So when it comes to sort of datafication of broadcasting institutions, but they are institutions that need to put out content every day. So they need to be very good at production flow control. And so their main purpose of developing metadata standards is being more effective at production, control every step. And thus so they also have a problem regarding that they tend to be very fragmented in-house. They all tend to be a lot of different kinds of archives, so various kinds of path-dependent older archives, as well as production process databases, and so on and so forth. Typically, there's a very little kind of interoperability. There's a lot of fragmentation. Different kinds of standards are used in those different databases or archives. So there is a lot of kind of ineffectiveness in those institutions. Yes, and again, also in case of broadcasters, there is this very significant issue as being dependent on various proprietary man providers. Yes, so these are the issues they have, and solution that has been gradually emerging, and gradually is a relative concept, because the solution emerged a few years ago in the sense that the old EBU core standard was transferred, was modified to have the RDF structure. But what I say gradually meant that only some, not all, not all members of the EBU have been adopted that standard. It is a gradual process. Some of them have, let's just say YLA in Finland and NRK in Norway, or the Dutch version, they have been very kind of thriving in these processes, and BBC, and that have been adopting these standards but then again, they don't do it in a they don't adopt these standards in a uniform way. Some are adopting different elements for different, let's say, processes. Some other for other elements and other processes. But this is why I said it's a gradual process. But it needs to be here maybe said out loud that EBU core is actually also it's not a European phenomenon. It doesn't not influence the sort of the system, the terrain in Europe, but also in the North of America. So, for instance, most famously, HBO has been adopting EBU core as their kind of core structure, and there are others. So, in the US context, they used to have another standard which was called PB core, so public PBS as the public broadcasting core. But especially more recently, they are increasingly thinking that maybe because these standards used to be quite similar, but maybe the similarity is not enough that maybe they need to transfer as a whole to the EBU core standard because of that RDF advantage. So there's no point in developing somewhat similar PB core standard and continue that with that separation. So yeah, but the point is also that when that happens in these public service institutions, when they start adopting the sort of the RDF-based EBU core standard, then effectively this means restructuring their many of their operations, how they manage their data in their organizations. So this has been enabling them to do things. Firstly, to do that sort of swipe gradually across all their SAP sub databases. So turn this in-house fragmentation gradually into sort of, there's no separate databases anymore, but it's gradually all the same. And secondly, this enables kind of convergence also in terms of their operations. What do they do? So some content, it's the same system, and some content they just put out linear, some content online. There's no separation between archive and the programming database, and so on. And this also means that they start putting out to the public in triple stores. So they, for instance, it's more easier to use schema.org, which is the search engine industry RDF standard. So they put out their content in triple stores using schema.org on their websites, as well as putting simply having APIs using RDF as a core structure. So yeah, but then okay. So on my slide, I'm having something about path dependencies. This refers to the fact that that the adaptation or adoption is kind of a gradual process. Some elements are adapted, some not, etc. Okay, but let's move on to the third group of institutions, which is the film, let's say private film and television industry. And here, because the broadcaster talk was mostly based on my interviews with the public broadcasters in Europe. But as I said, this standard has been already adopted. It's gradually adopted by various private institutions as well. But especially when it comes to the film context and institutions that produce, so independent producers that produce, let's say, TV series. It may come as a surprise that we always think that in the big institutions such as Hollywood studios or institutions such as, I don't know, Google, that where you can have transactions, download and watch films, etc., that they must be very well organized, right? So they are big platforms, they are big institutions, and this must be they must be cavalier and bad and smooth in everything they do. Actually, the truth is entirely vice versa. That it's the biggest mess actually, and so there's a lot of, how to put it, dissatisfaction, a lot of ineffectiveness in let's just say film and TV distribution industry. Where to start? The main driver of the standardization process in this area, one institution is called Movie Labs. Movie Labs is an NGO in Hollywood that was started by Hollywood studios in order to speak the same language with the technology companies, with the platforms, and it started in 2006. So the focus then was, was pirating. The big issue for the industry was pirating, and to do something about it. Yeah. So it was all first that when I was just kind of fighting pirating and controlling this and getting standards in terms of when content is being distributed, then protecting this. But they also realized that a lot of this kind of problem is that they lacked clear identifiers. So there was the issue of transparency in the field. So if you copy a film, you have different versions of films. You don't understand how these different versions or films at all relate to each other. Yeah? If you want to collect copyright, you need to have relatively good transparency of what's actually happening in the market. Who's using, who's watching what. And that's one of the next steps. What they did was introducing either. So you see this acronym on the screen. Actually, I don't remember right now what these capital letters are referring to. But literally, they realized that in this industry is missing. Films are missing identifiers. And actually, they actually did. I just cannot say right now what memory is blank, but there is an institution in copyright tracing institution in Europe that sort of had also an identifier, but it was very ineffective, so it wasn't really used much. So eventually, Movie Labs introduced either, and in order to attach an identification to each film. And either, by the way, is very simple technologically. It's effectively reused TOI standard that we all know as academics, yeah, TOI. So it's effectively there's a very little metadata that goes with that that identifying number, like the title, director, producing studio, release year, basically. That's all. And this was necessary because, again, the situation is such that literally, even these days, when films are being distributed, studios, whatever, who is the production company, starts distributing film, there's a distributing company, etc., etc. Film information is being sent to different platforms, or cinemas, or playing companies, etc. Then what travels is an Excel file. So there's a lot of people working with Excel files, exchanging these, and there's no clarity what should be in those Excel files, and there's always kind of it needs a lot of kind of labor attached to it to process all this, and there's a lot of confusion most of the time. There's also confusion in terms of because what's in the metadata is so irregular. This is making hard two things. It makes hard localization. So if you're a distribution company and you want to localize your film, the whole argument of in the European broader regulation processes, copyright reform, etc., has been that there cannot be a single market, right, in Europe, because, and we need to keep the whole territory-based distribution, because you need to localize, you need to explain the film to the local audience, otherwise they won't get it, right? So, but actually localization is difficult because the metadata is so chaotic typically, and there's no kind of cues, there's not enough of information for doing that localization. And yeah, so yeah, so this is why IDLE has been actually important in that broader ecosystem of things, because it's kind of the missing stone in the broader system. So movie labs have been also building on in many ways the work done in Europe, EVU core, etc. They're RDF-based developments, and they have been developing their own kind of metadata standards for the audiovisual, or say, film and television industry, and entertainment-related film and television industry. So developing new kind of common description ontologies, and now more recently, so that simply to exchange information between platforms and yeah, studios and distributors, etc. So, but also the most recent one that they actually produced, not most recent one, but something they also quite recently published, was starting to collect data about reception from different various public databases such as Wikipedia, Wikidata, Rotten Tomatoes, etc., IMDb. So they didn't even actually have that sort of systematized collection of data until more or less this year. And very recent, actually just 2 weeks ago, Movie Labs published a new product. So as I said, broadcasters have been working on production standardization for a long while now. So Movie Labs now 2 weeks ago published the standard ontology for describing production processes. And this is again highly relevant in the era of, let's say, pandemic, and also in the globalization, in the context of globalization of production processes. So if you are, let's say, a Hollywood studio or any studio, really anywhere, if you commission your special effects or your animations or what have you from wherever around the world, then you need to be able to describe what you want or what you commission, or very precisely. And so there is increasing issue of now in the film industry as well to standardize this as well. So and now finally they have got there. But if to conclude, and of course they talk a lot in the sort of this film and television industry, this entertainment industry, that they need to do a lot of, I mentioned localization already, but they need to do a lot of personalization. But for personalization to happen, again, they first need to fix the metadata, because you may have some user data, but if your metadata about the content is in generally in quite a mess, then it's very difficult to create this match still. So what has been happening now in the last couple of years is again the emergence of new kinds of companies that do this kind of coordinating, cleaning, systematizing their metadata, at least for the new productions. So they pull in what they get from public resources available in the internet, and also yeah, so various kind of localized versions, etc., etc. So there's these kind of coordinating institutions in between. And of course, they build a lot on the existing standards, whatever movie labs have been working, developing, as well as what the European TV industries have been developing. Okay, so let's try to move towards the conclusion now. So it's also, I think I forgot to mention that when movie labs develop, for instance, that creative works ontology, which is about all kinds of market analytics from public resources, then this is now also RDF based. So they are moving also towards this direction. And the context here is that I need to mention briefly, because I reread these interviews of the movie labs people just this morning. So kind of everybody hates the RDF because it's so complex and hard to manage, but that's because there's nothing else available. So they still do it because it's better than anything else. Yes, so what is happening to start conclusion? So it seems that in all types of institutions, the last few years, they have been finally taking this move, this step towards starting in various ways, building on or adopting so RDF, so based solutions, so various kind of semantic web technologies. Public film archives show that to be better at interoperability to cut the costs. Broadcasters, in some sense, to achieve certain interoperability in-house in the large institutions, because they tend to actually exchange files using still XML. And private industries so that actually simply control the distribution process, so, and again pull in various kinds of metadata so that to do the distribution simply more effectively. Yes. Okay. So in my kind of conceptual framework, this could mean certain, as a broader system, certain public-private innovation coordination that public, especially European public institutions such as bigger film archives, as well as especially public broadcasters, have been developing standards. I've been moving towards solutions that, that private industries can use to build on and adopt. It is clearly that in many other walks of life, regulation areas of telecommunications, of ICTs, EBU, you may know that is a kind of regulatory powerhouse. Sorry, not EBU, EU, yeah, Europe. Europe is a regulatory powerhouse. Europe is not often the first mover in markets, but it's very good at, because it's a big market and it has good knowledge in terms of, experience, skills in terms of standardization processes. So it seems to be that in this area as well, not of course EU per se, but still the European organizations, especially the EBU, have been able have certain specific capacity, structural designs that enables them to work on these standards that are kind of public goods or publicly valuable, so that all kinds of other institutions start to adopt them as well for various reasons. But then the US-based private organizations have been building partly on them, but also have been kind of injecting other valuable components into that broader ecosystem of standards. So either some more recent ontologies and standards that have been coming out from the movie labs. And not to mention schema.org, which is in some sense problematic because, of course, it's driven by the interest of search engines to do better at what they provide, the services they provide. But still, let's just say European public broadcasters still use schema.org because it helps them to put out content on the web in a way that can be beneficial to many other parties. And then yeah, so we can conclude that maybe what we're having is a linked data as an emergent open data system. It is not there yet. It is still emerging. But what kind of is emerging via the contributions of both public and private organizations. And I'm done. And what needs to be said here is, as I said at the very beginning, that that this is still ongoing. So this, what I presented to you, is a kind of very broad brush conclusions. So what, in terms of what is happening. And I hope that in this discussion, I will kind of arrive at, there will be new insights that I can use in my work. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everybody back. So I've switched to the gallery mode, so we're all there. So Viina immediately has a question, like, if you have questions, either lift your hand like Viuna does, or put your name in the chat or something, or say, I have a question. You don't need to type the question, it's just for me as a sequence. This has been a very inspiring talk, and there has been a lot of stuff that we can cover. So it would be great if we sort of find time to talk about different aspects. Okay, so Viuna, you went first.
Thanks, Max, and thanks, Indrek, for your great talk. There's a lot in there to cover, of course. Maybe as a researcher working with a database, the databases containing mostly metadata, I wonder if you could comment the different identification codes used across databases and across countries. How they affect our work as researchers, or someone who is trying to work with these databases, who's trying to interrelate them. And of course, I'm already hinting that perhaps there are problems in doing so. And so maybe you also have some solutions already for us as people who try to work amongst those standards and actually use the data in a meaningful way.
Yeah, so what needs to be said first, I'm not a data scientist, so I don't very often don't know how to do things. But yeah, so you asked what kind of identifiers to use. Well, that is the problem, that there are many different systems, and typically the problem is that, as I said, that for instance, in case of either, that in many ways the European broadcasters have been inspiring the actions in the US context, but European public broadcasters have not adopted either for some reason. But this may be also only a matter of time, because it seems that the bigger platforms, and some also, let's just say, some leading film archives, such as BFI in the UK, have been adopting that system already. Of course, it seems to be that the standardization is unavoidably also kind of a cultural issue. So these standards have been broadly adopted in the English language countries, but not so much in other countries. Yeah. So I've been also kind of talking to Movie Labs people, and they say that, you know, it's all about their outreach they do to kind of convince the different kinds of institutions to adopt one standard identifier, because until this happens, this kind of inability to interrelate different databases, different archives will continue. And as you know, that we have been working on Sinando data, so Marché de Films, the Cannes Film Festival database. We know that there are same film in different versions, and very many versions sometimes. And this would be an easy way to solve that problem. And I know actually that Movie Labs people who heard from me that the issue that the Cannes is having and they would be very interested actually to work on field markets as well, because they see that these institutions are absolutely central in some ways to market operations. So if field markets could adopt these standards as well, then this could be another reason for some other, let's say, national institutions such as National Film Archives or national broadcasters to adopt those.
I have a comment which maybe Mila, which feeds directly into this. I think from our side, as sort of the data people in CUDAN, one can say this is actually sort of our core mission. Like, what you just asked, like, how does this express itself in the data? Does it express itself in the data? If it is expressed in the data, like if standards are applied, the key question is, do they make sense? Are there, what else do we find in the data? Where does the standard not fit with it? And with that, what other emergent stuff happens in the data? That simple thing, there's lots of sources of local activity, not only history itself, but also the data curation subject to local activity. And that not only includes sort of the data itself, but also the standards. The standards themselves are developed in local activity. There's always a subset of humanity sitting together defining a standard. And then the people who apply them, like if you enter data based on a standard, you have a particular notion of that standard. And that notion may be fundamentally different than the librarian who sits on the next computer. And so that is, I think, a very, very important point. And so that leads to, I think, one thing that we can use as a, and this is sort of like to the rest of the world, whoever sees this recording, a working standard that has emerged as working really well, which is, yes, we want to have these like general standards. I want to have the IMDb number of a movie or the Rotten Tomatoes ID of a movie. But as long as I don't know if that's, in painting, there's the painter who paints sheep from Naples, that's like his name. And then there's a painter who paints sheep in Naples, but it's not the painter who paints sheep with this and that ID number. I need to assign a local ID number before I sort of like make the external connection, because otherwise I can never fix that mistake. And so that is sort of something where we should be emancipated enough to create our own IDs, while at the same time working with the sort of shared ID space. And I think that is a super important thing. And what then is left as a question, and this I think is a really important one, because there is proponents of massive standard systems, and there's people who say, I don't care, like, Werner Herzog couldn't care less, right? And he does good movies. So the question is, what is the minimum standard? What do we actually need as a standard? And the answer is sort of now 10 years after, 15 years after the W3C has discussed this a lot, is coming out of the industry, which is what Indrek just outlined. They do DOIs, they do IDs, and they don't do massive metadata systems, which, like, for example, for versions of film, I encourage everybody to look into FRBR, FRBR, which is sort of where you look at, here's the film tape, here's the film. In general, there's many tapes that float around. That film is sort of like, an instance of Dune the Story, for which there is also the book, which is an instance of maybe, space opera in general. And that kind of hierarchy, if you have an object and you have to place it in that hierarchy, that's conceptual work. And that conceptual work may not be available in terms of like working time at the given moment in time. So people just assign an ID, and we should be fine with that, because once you have an ID, you can do the conceptual work. If you don't have the ID, you can't. And so that is sort of like the minimum standard we should agree on. And as data scientists, we should demand. If I get a data set from somebody, ideally would love to have an ID on every record attached. So I actually can refer to, and I can go back and say, hey, dear news agency, dear film industry company, I'm talking about this thing, what happened there? That is, I think, what the public also can demand. So IDs are the most valuable public good in that sense. So that's like the perspective from the data side, I think. And I don't know, I hope this makes sense, Indrek.
If I could add here, the whole argument, let's say in the field archive content of why do you have RDF, why do you have linked data format, is to keep that local difference. Mm-hmm. Because you can have a general system, but you can still have another link, which is the local description, yeah? And that's the whole idea in some sense that, you know, in the Belgian or Italy case, there are place names, especially the Belgian case, there are place names that are in 3 different languages. So you need to have that variations in the system. Or let's say Belgium has the issue of their Congo colony, and there's a local name and there's a what's it called? Colonized name. Colonial name, yeah. So so in this sense, there is this understanding that with these kinds of data structures, you can have kind of both. Yeah? You can have that, which Max was saying, that it is important to have that, to keep the cultural difference. Yeah, and it's even absolutely important to model realities in different ways, but still have the kind of linking to the broader systems. And then for us as data scientists, or for you as data scientists, to study those relationships, these broader cultural flows and dynamics.
Mila.
Yeah, I actually think that my question was partially already discussed, but at the same time, I think that I yeah, just maybe rephrase it and form it as a question. So yeah, I first of all, I really enjoyed this talk, and I think it's really interesting to look at kind of like these practices of standardization and discussions of systematization, how we are dealing with that in today's world with the digitized cultural artifacts and so on. I just started to think that there are always kind of like these plans or standards, but then of course there are also practices of how they are implemented and how people actually interpret them. And for instance, like you mentioned already these local variation, but I think that there can be also individual variation and in regards kind of like how metadata is put there. Like Xenia and Veyune and others, we have been working with this Soviet newsreel data. So it's kind of like visible that in a way, it's not only that it has some local specifics, but I think that it's also visible kind of like that there has been different individuals adding the metadata. So kind of like interpreting what is actually a description, how should I put that, what is it kind of like the timestamp there for, and these kinds of like very individual things. So it's also kind of like tied not only to the individual interpretation, but of course also to the time used by these individuals, how much time do they want to use in kind of like adding the metadata and so on. So I just wanted to ask, did you, in your interviews, did you also discuss kind of like the interpretations and actual practices of adding the metadata in different organizations, or did you mostly discuss these kind of like more like the standards that were discussed?
No, standard is a very broad concept, and so yes, absolutely, I did. And as I said, at the beginning, I introduced that this project was this interview-based sub project was part of a broader project where we also simply looked into various databases, and or for instance, I'm having simply kind of close knowledge of, let's say, how Estonian film database has been put together. And so there is a lot of kind of voluntary, it is semi-folksonomy. So there's a lot of, they have been using the help of students at BFM, et cetera, who have been always adding their own tags, yeah? And so actually majority of tags in Estonian film database are only used once, I think 70%. So this indicates that there's been a lot of freedom, yeah? But in this context, And in some sense, for instance, what Max was saying, it is important to keep that richness of description that kind of emerged from the local life, so to speak. But what I also noticed is what matters in different countries is the institutional setup. So what is the film, or what broader institution, let's say, is a film archive part of? Is it closely related to the broadcaster, public broadcaster? Is it like in Estonia, it's part of the National Archive, so documentary archive, or like in Norway, where it is part of the National Library, or what are the practices of different kinds of institutions collaborating? So have the authorities forced them to collaborate, or are some sort of programs or not? For instance, or when they are kind of on their own and being closely operating with the industry. So for instance, Danish Film Institute and their database is very interesting because Film Institute is an institution that collaborates or is closely related to the industry itself. And in Denmark, filmmakers use the film database as their CV building system. Yeah, so they're making sure that there's a lot of data in the database, that it's all correct, and so that they can print it out at any point or just send the information as part of the package. So in this sense, it's already kind of you build it as your portfolio in a way as a filmmaker, and this is actually part of the same here in Estonia, that filmmakers. Actually, the filmmakers need to give that data to the Estonian Film Institute that hands that data over to the film database. So it's kind of the same. Or in case of Norway, where a lot of library standards are being put into use. So these kinds of local institutional setups start mattering of what's the data like, yeah? Or how well is the film data connected to as in case of libraries, to all the books and all other spheres of data. And you being Finnish, I can also say that I find Finnish film archive very interesting because it's very closed. It's very good, and they have lots of data if you look into it. But you need to go in-house, and you cannot access it in any other way, and you need to spend time there, which is peculiar to me. I don't know what's the cultural reason for that, but it's just for some reason it is. So yeah, so there's a lot of variations, and it would be kind of another study, or maybe part of the same study, to make conclusions when it comes to national scenes of how things are being defined and used and standardized. Yeah.
I'd like to add something which I think makes sense. I talked with the unit like a year ago or something about this. In some sense, there's many fields where data is collected in different densities and different standards, even though people are sort of like bird watching is an interesting thing, right? So people sort of agree it's about counting birds. And so some people just note down the geocoordinate where they have seen the bird. And you can imagine that sort of corresponds well with where humans hang out and probably not where the birds hang out. But then there's other places such as Poland, which actually sort of dissects the country into 50 by 50 kilometer grids. And then sort of all they want to know is the grid cell in which the bird is. And obviously, if you then compare Germany versus Poland, this looks very different. And the data is biased in different ways. And so if you want to look at European bird migration, you have at least, I don't know, 30 countries going on, where you need to sort of like come up with a certain transformation to bring this in one mathematical model. So species distribution, for example, is a field that actually has found solutions for that. They're non-trivial. And we should be aware that, like, you know, in our case, it's not any different. So if we look at that kind of data, we need people like Indrek who know what the local specifics are. And then on the other end, it may not be sufficient to just use sort of, you know, digital humanities, cultural, creative industries techniques, but there may be a moment when you want to call in somebody who has their act together in terms of geographical distribution normalization. which even in the species distribution crowd is like only 1 in 10 people. And so that is sort of an interesting thing, and one of the reasons why, as CUDAN, it makes sense to hang out together, because sometimes the solution needs to come out from a different corner. There is nobody raises their hand, so maybe let me just push it in one direction, which I think is quite interesting. This discussion, all the keywords that we heard, Indrek, in your talk, were very resonant with discussions that were going on in the W3C around 2010 to 2012. And it's really interesting to see this now filled out in like the film industry. The same happens in the library industry. The same happened behind closed door for whatever goes on in YouTube or Facebook and stuff like that. And one of the interesting things is that we're talking about networks. Like if you talk linked data, if you talk triple stores, like some in the audience may not know what a triple store is. So triple store is a 3-column list, subject, predicate, object. So some film was done by some director, for example, right? And so that is source node, link, target node. So it's actually an edge list of a network. You can immediately just drop that into G5 Cytoscape, wherever you want, and draw a network. That's actually also a thing people in arts and technology do a lot. But so the key thing here is this lends itself to network science, which raises obviously the same question as any other field that lends itself to network science, where you can say, okay, that's discrete data. You split your system into nodes, which films arguably are, individuals arguably are. But how about continuous data? Like, how about the aspects of whatever you're talking about that cannot be captured with discrete data? And so let me give you one example. There's a really glorious tome, a book, which is called the Compendium of Bildstörungen, of sort of video distortions, which are obviously an analog phenomenon. Like, how do you actually sort of like deal with that? Like, from your experience in industry, Indrek, how is there any limits to this paradigm of using linked data? Is it bound to only capture well-defined, ideable things like movies, films, people, maybe locations or stuff like that? Like, but where is the boundary, and where I'm pretty sure people complain that certain things cannot be captured by this, or is this not a problem?
No, it is. I would, in some sense, to answer that question really properly, I would need to go back to my data. I'm not kind of prepared to have this question right now, but how to put it? Of course, there are different uses for that data. So I in my presentation, I presented why different kinds of institutions right now, or last several years, have started this move towards linked data. Mm-hmm. And yes, it is quite an interesting phenomenon. I'm not a computer scientist, but there was a kind of buzz around linked data, as you said, 10+ years ago, and then it's been dying off. It even lost its kind of brand. Mm-hmm. Because what we used to know as as Web 3.0 used to be the semantic web, yeah? Mm-hmm. Now it's the blockchain web. So the brand was stolen even, yeah? Mm-hmm. Because it became kind of not trendy at some point. So, and again, I'm not a computer scientist, so I don't really know what's the kind of, I've heard that, everybody's saying it's semantic web is useless, and YouTube adopted it at some point, and then they didn't anymore at some point, and things like this. But it seems that certain kinds of the whole semantic web thing in the area of culture and in cultural institutions and big institutions such as film studios and film market, very complex markets, have been needing this time to move towards this. Mm-hmm. There's nothing easy about it. As I said, that again, this picture that when it comes to this whole film trade market, you cannot believe how big a mess it actually is. So there's a time that is necessary to do the change, yeah. But then again, of course, everything doesn't need to be linked data. Yeah? So, for instance, as we talked about national specificities, everybody's also talking about the reuse. Yeah? So, what another claim that goes with this digitization of archives is this kind of new wave of postmodernism, or more of recycling, more of cultural memory, kind of, and memory being recycled and reformed and redefined and all that. So, and there's a lot of focus actually in these industries on what is your unit? Is it the film, or is it the shot, or is it the scene, or such? And some institutions have been going through a lot of effort using various methods to describe shots, or more like scenes, in a sense that so that the stuff can be reused. Yeah, the filmmakers, and if they need a particular kind of shot, they find it immediately. And there you don't need linked data. You just need to have some other system. Yeah. So yeah, you don't really need linked data for all these in-house processes as well to be very effective. You just need things relatively open and relatively clear and enable variations. And this is what linked data enables, these variations, these unexpected, these new links, so to speak. And this is why the organizations see this as beneficial. But yeah, so it's a good question. Maybe I need to think about it some more.
Thank you very much. I also, there's now more hands, that's great. One thing we could add is like Google search now runs on the Google Knowledge Graph to a large percentage. So obviously there is a niche, quote unquote, niche for linked data, because that's exactly what it is. Anders Conno, I am assuming that Zoom lines them up in a row, so Anders Conno would be first.
Yeah, I remember reading your interview with Jean-Pierre Ebin, who is an author of this EBUCOR, and definitely this can be used inside a media organization for very various purposes on the one hand. But do you think, and then as I've been talking to ERR people and asking about how they feel about linked data and EBUCOR, they seem to have no full understanding of the different options that this approach to data could give them, but they could benefit from it. And they start talking always about this media asset management vendors and how a certain update will take like 6 months or 7 months or 5 months, etc. So do you think there is a, I don't know, market distortion in this respect? If they had some options inside their media asset management, then they would be eager to adopt this linked data system, the linked data approach as well. I mean,
yeah, market failure. Yes, I mean, there's another, when it comes to the political economy of these standards, and as I said, I mean, ERR is a perfect example of another phenomenon. Is very small institutions that are clearly under-resourced. So any transfer is very difficult for them. And so to even stay up to date with broad technology development processes in Europe is too much for them. Yeah, so it's a challenge. Yeah, so that's one thing. But the MAM vendors obviously is an issue not only for ERR and the proprietary solutions, and this is another reason for the slowness of adoption and the development of these standards. So yes, for instance, the Dutch are, if you know the audiovisual standards, standardization, ontology development, all that, a little bit about it, then you know that the Dutch are absolutely, you know, path breakers and where things are happening in this field. And also academically, the best scholars are in Netherlands. And even when I interviewed them a couple of years ago, even they had a question. Yes, we have these nice standards, but how is this stuff going to be implemented by the MAM vendors and MAM solutions? And so, but by now, actually, I can say that these MAM solutions have been also emerging. There's a Spanish vendor that has been building on top of the EBU core audio-based, and there are solutions in the US, the vendors in the US that do that. So also for these reasons, things have been slow, and in some sense, there's always the how to put it, big question in standardization studies: when to standardize, or when to adopt the standard? So sometimes it's better to wait a little, yeah. And it may have been exactly the case in this case as well. So maybe it's now the time to start looking into these relevant MAM solutions that simply did not exist before.
Isn't this also like a chicken and egg problem? Because you know, the Dutch obviously are leading because they are leading in semantic web, Frank van Harmelen and whatever. But they're not leading in the analysis part. They're not leading in the network science part. Probably Dutch people may like now be grumpy, but you know, you would expect this maybe coming from other European countries or even the US. And so then the question is, obviously, you know, if you only have one part of the equation, if you say, oh, let's put everything into a standard because we're Dutch or German, which is like ironically what people do in Dutch in the Netherlands and Germany, is see Wikipedia, but not the kind of analysis part where you say, oh, let's harness what we actually have here. The interoperability allows me to analyze, do stuff, which obviously once I have found results, I can put that back into the data. So I can actually, you need to get the feedback loop going, right? And I think that is sort of, again, this is an interesting opportunity for CUDAN, because here we have sort of like, you know, one could say even like on a very conceptual level, the feedback loop between semiotics and cultural analysis is exactly like that, right? Like building an ontology, applying the ontology, analyzing how I can see the world through that, and then basically updating the ontology in essence. So that is it's a really interesting opportunity, which seems like in many places didn't happen. Mar.
Yeah, very interesting talk. When you were talking, I was just like thinking the project that we are doing with Antonina, that we are compiling the public collections, art collections, the data, and yeah, so far for every museum that we had gathered, there is no standard. Each of the museums in Europe, they have their own way of starting from the dates of how to put the date of birth of the artist and the death, and there is no standardization, at least that I had found in the data that I'm receiving from the museums, which of course the art is not an industry, like, but then you are explaining that there are millions of standards and there is like in big institutions is also a mess, and I was kind of surprised because it was, well, anyway. What you can draw the parallels from what you found, and you can think on, for example, what we're studying with Antonina, the museums. And because, like, for example, it's quite surprising, like when we asked Tukumu to get the data, basically the object that they have in their collections, from which artists they are, and we have problems to get that. And just like you are, this quote that you are saying, that the metadata is kind of doing the history and the perception of the history and so on. But when you want to study and you don't get this data from the institution, it's kind of frustrating as a researcher.
Yeah, so a little bit background here is that I know about this case because I've been to Mara and Antonina, because I've been helping them to get the data out of Kumu, the Estonian Art Museum. And in some sense, maybe I may be wrong, but in some sense, the situation here is exactly the kind of, how to put it, the institutional readiness to serve, to understand their function in the era of datafications, to understand it differently. Because as far as I understand the issue, why don't they want to give that data to you? It's not so much that they don't want to, but it would mean a lot of work for them, non-standard work. They don't know how to do it or something like that. And they are kind of unsure about it, also probably related. So, and this means that these kind of questions, it's the first time they need to encounter this, more or less. Yeah. It is not a standard procedure. Yeah. And this, in some sense, your case is very good because this kind of provoked a big discussion between them and the ministry and the other external relevant authorities. So probably the end result of that would be that something will improve. Yeah. I simply don't know so much about the art field, and is there any standardization or how the museums are exchanging files or this and that? Probably they are more oriented towards exchanging the actual artworks and not so much the digital reproductions or data about them. In the case of film archives, it's an old practice to exchange films because to have these various kinds of, how to put it, viewing events and festivals and this and that. So this is what this is why it's all more standardized, and the film archives are well kind of institutionalized across the world. There's the FIAF, rather strong and important institution.
I mean, I still sorry that I interrupt. That I still think that what you said about that innovation system, that the chain of value is the same in art, because if you put good data in the internet available, historians from another part of the world will actually refer more to, I don't know, Estonian art, and probably will make relations with their own local art scene, and maybe the movements that happen here with their things that they had to study. Means wherever you actually multiply the data, you can actually create new meanings and new histories that before were not known. I can say that whenever we ask to different museums what we're asking, that I can share to the people, that is like very little data points, like name of the artist, year that had collected the art, and when was born this artist, and so on. There has been told to us that, oh, you are asking too much data because we are asking the entire collection, and they don't understand. And they said, but tell me what you are interested in. They said, no, we are interested in everything. But they don't understand that until we get everything, for example, now from Reina Sofia, we had this graph of where this artist has art of their collection has been produced. Means we know the distribution, and we know, okay, they had been, their peak is in the 37, which actually is very interesting period. And then we know, okay, this year is very covered, but there is some actually other periods that are low cover. Means we know the distribution of their art. Means that, like, you can, just by this, you can know a lot of things.
Yeah, so to comment this in the context of the film archives, just quickly to jump back what Max was saying. On the one hand, the Dutch are good because they have done two parallel things. They have built up proper institutions. They have funded their institutions well. So they have Institute of Sound and Vision, that basically broadcasting archives that are the kind of empowered institutions, and then the I Institute, which is their film archive. And these institutions are also collaborating with academia a lot. So the universities of Utrecht and Amsterdam are very good at this kind of archive education, also in the audiovisual field. Now, the context you just mentioned that, oh, would the data be available? It would be so great. It would be good for the innovation system. I absolutely agree. In some sense, this is why this was my initial motivation, because effectively I was a kind of an activist first. I was just promoting this agenda of digitizing the Estonian audiovisual heritage so that it could be reused by multiple partners, private companies, schools, education system, etc. But in the process of obviously, and this it didn't end up there. So people were thinking about this in the same way, and it's quite interesting how audiovisual heritage and digitization and data sharing has been emphasized in the relevant EU documents specifically. So there's a clear kind of policy agenda to have that more and fund that, etc. But still, in this context, one of the kind of side aspects of my interviews was that that I'm hearing in the interviews, hey, but actually we're also having this API, but nobody's using it. Yeah. So, oh, wow, you have this API, yeah? Okay, interesting. But it was actually, as a matter of fact, last week that because we are now, as some of you know, we are working on ERR programming data as well. And we had an idea, what if to compare this to the YLA, so the Finnish data. And I wrote to that Finnish YLA person who mentioned to me in the interview, hey, we are having this programming API. And he said, yeah, we should have this, but let me just, where is it? I mean, it's not sure. And then he has been now searching for it for 1.5 weeks of how to get access to it. And in the interview, he complained that nobody's really using it. So in this sense, for the kind of innovation system, what you need is not just the availability of things, but also institutions and programs oriented towards actually using this stuff. Yeah. So like says by finding CUDAN, for instance, or other similar initiatives. So so you need institutions and basically a little bit of policy push towards these things.
Yeah. So to underscore basically what you both are saying, Mar, it is indeed like that everything that Indrek talked about exists in the art world, has been discussed since the mid-90s. So there is these core metadata standards like Dublin Core, VRA Core, FRBR, CDOC CRM, VIF with a V, not an F, which is for people, like all these things, and they have been fought over. So I chuckled when I saw Indrek's talk title, like virulently to the blood, that they need to be applied. You can only do this way, not that way. You cannot collect data without such a standard. I was working for a database company collecting data without standard because we thought like people gonna, fudge with the data standards anyway. And standards are incomplete. Dublin Core had an artist field, but didn't have, many other types of people, for example. So people misused the artist fields to add certain things. And now what you see, many of these museum collection data, they have been collected using these kind of things, like Visual Resource Core, VRA Core, may have been used to catalog the images of artworks and may have made it into some of these databases you are seeing, but obviously they have been adapted for particular exhibitions, for particular uses in books and stuff like that. So they look different again. And so it's interesting to look at the actual data, how it looks like. And the argument which we should make to ERR, or to what Andres Connes said, to people who say, hold their data back, oh, no, we need to first implement it in this other way. That the standard argument in libraries that is similar to saying I need to re-update my MIM database is to say, oh, no, we're moving from this one library catalog provider to this other library catalog provider, and until this happens, we cannot give you the data. That is not how we should operate. We should look at the data as it looks, and it should be possible as a public value. And this is something which is easily communicable to people like Kumu. If the Kumu data is not in our analysis, it will not be in our publications. If it's not in our publications, people won't see the Kumu artwork that may be relevant. So Gagosian Gallery maybe do an exhibition on a particular artist that is spread out over 15 galleries, but they may miss the one thing at Kumu. And that thing in Kumu may have less value. You can't add another 0 to the price because it hasn't been a Gagosian gallery. And so that kind of stuff is something which is, I think, fundamentally important. And I'm not the first person who says this. The first person who said similar things was Tim Berners-Lee right at the beginning of the World Wide Web, where he said, people who don't do hyperlinks and don't allow their web page to be seen will be forgotten. And that's exactly what will happen. So it's a really interesting thing that we're operating here with two, like the art world, the media, film, movie, TV industry, while at the same time, the whole discussion, you can actually strip it of these cultural sort of labels, and you will end up with the same discussion that people have about the World Wide Web and semantic web in general. And so it's a really interesting thing, like where we can see how important our field is, because it's one of the fields where this is actually something you can communicate to broader audience and as relevant. Mike.
Yep. Well, first of all, thank you for this presentation. For me, it's completely new subject, to be honest, and it is quite a lot of information to process. So maybe my questions will be relatively stupid. What sort of fascinated me from what you told is that how different motivations of different actors are. Yes, so there are different stakeholders which have completely different set of priorities. And so, well, one question I want to ask is to try to understand, well, at least in your opinion, is it reasonable to expect that it converges to some sort of universal standard? Or is it reasonable to expect that there will be some sort of separate standards for separate, well, businesses which maybe connect with each other, as Mark suggested, by some bare-bone ID, common ID, which can be allowed to translate from one to the other. And by the way, probably it should, well, I would expect that it should be more developed in the books industry. Yes, so there is also probably libraries on the one hand and publishers on the other hand, and they have maybe completely different priorities in how they catalog the data. Maybe you know how it develops there. Is there a common standard or not?
No, I don't know, but actually it's just ad hoc thinking was right now that yes, the library cataloging ways are very specific. And we ourselves did a study where library cataloging system, it's called, you say decimal system, has been used for newspaper clippings, and how much it distorts the reality if you use it kind of to search for information for newspaper clippings online. So you can get very sort of not good results. Yeah. So but you asked at first about the kind of is it going to be a universal standard? No, obviously it's hard, because again, we are living in the real world. There are real path dependencies, real costs. Any change costs. Yeah. So typical path dependency definition in innovation studies where it grew out from is effectively indicates that any change costs, and so if the cost is too much, things are not simply happening. But yeah, it would be kind of, let's just say something that I haven't really looked at is the whole production standardization. But let's just imagine, I kind of hypothesize what's happening. So let's say in Europe, France televisions have been for quite a while been standardizing the production process. So because it's super important for television channels that everything is smooth and everything is controlled and everybody knows what clipping is coming from, who's the author, who gets the payment, or all that. But then now Hollywood studios have done the same, yeah. But then again, many of the independent content providers would need to interact various parties. You deliver an animation or special effect to I don't know, ZDF or the BBC or I don't know, CBN in the US. So and so is it a problem? Yeah, that you need to interact with these various kinds of production metadata systems, or do we need to, or is it a problem that these are unmatching? People, organizations cannot operate, and this is a real market. People are working. You need to be really effective. You need to deliver by deadline and all that. Mm-hmm. What will happen in this area? I'm just throwing out the kind of questions. I don't have answers, of course, but it may well be that in this area that demands real effectiveness, you probably need some standardization. But of course, the movie labs people told me that even this production process, there's a character development. Yeah, any Hollywood studio has a different understanding what a character is, or character subtypes, etc. So if you commission something, you need to really agree what are you commissioning, and so everybody needs to agree.
And breaking the standard is an innovation, right?
It may be an innovation, but it also means that you won't get paid and you're out of the market. Yeah? So because again, this is a market that needs certain effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. I have
actually one more question, well, more specific one. Can you say, because about some standards you sort of explained what's in them, and maybe I missed this EBU core, which was mentioned several times. What is there? What is not there? What is
it's actually
essentially about?
It's actually mostly about production and less so about content description. Mm-hmm. So yeah, defining all the roles and the aims of the program and all that. Mm-hmm. So that's what's mainly there. I wanted to say something else, but no.
Who came up with this EBU core? Was it a collaboration, or and also how does it relate to like these EU policies that you also?
No, it's not related to the EU policy at all. Well, not in a very concrete way. Although it's a good question, maybe I need to think about it. But it's, of course, it's. I mean, the whole. To be honest, I don't know the early history. I don't have an answer in terms of the early history of EBU core. But EBU core is actually just one of the standards that EBU has been developing. Again, there's a EBU, we all know Eurovision, but the other thing that EBU is really coordinating is a news exchange. So, and so they are doing a lot in this area. And the problem was that, well, not a problem, it's a thing, it's an interesting thing. Is that I know that the EBU people were consulting also W3C when they developed their semantic web standard for media content, yeah. But then there has not been much standardization in this area when it comes to W3C standards, semantic web standards, and media ont, it's called media ontology, mm-hmm. And kind of EBU moved ahead. So already somebody, Andres, you mentioned the name Jean-Pierre Ivan, who is now retired. He was the EBU main metadata guy. And it's again, I'm not an historian, but I'm also interested in I'm also cultural semiotician, so I would need to say that I'm interested in the broad structures of how culture is framed, yeah. But actually, I'm also interested in the role of individual in the history, so to speak. And I'm in this context, I'm interested in the role of Jean-Pierre Ivan in the whole ecosystem development, because one thing is that he's super knowledgeable and he's been central to most of the decentralization processes. And one thing he told me was that he hopes that the W3C doesn't want to start standardizing again, because they usually break things and they don't do things very well, which may be a reference to a W3C kind of specific nature, that it's all kind of not only consensus based, but it's also as I said at the beginning, driven a lot by the American big platforms and big institutions with a lot of big pockets. So it may always not be maybe best for the European public organizations what they come up with, or so yeah, I don't know. I can go on and on. Yeah, so basically.
Now you just brought up something, which it's like there's two questions. One is there is non-W3C standards like IIIF, International Image Interaction Framework, which now also is applied to movies and to geographic maps, which obviously makes so much sense, and we desire them since like 25 years. Everybody who works with image subsections, for example, has to work with them, because what the W3C came up with sort of didn't work. And so the question is like, you know, how does this stuff swim up? Like what is the transition criterion when you have similar to Betamax and VHS, and like why does VHS win out? Like what actually would be the market driver in such a niche area? Because we're not talking about something that is at the consumer level, but something that's at the, like every large business has to make that decision, which is a handful of people in Estonia and a handful of people in any other mid-sized country. So how can we make sure that like sort of meaningful standards actually come to be? Is that, do you think that this has to happen at a policy level, or is it again Facebook or one large driver or something?
That's a good question. Okay, so I guess I have not, when I've been dealing with this topic, I've been actually not interested in the specific standards. Yeah, I don't care if it's VHS or Betamax. Beta was actually beginning. So, but what I'm, I guess, interested in is what comes out of these struggles and how good they are, or what do they do in the culture, yeah? And how to put it, thus to understand what do we have, why. And as a matter of fact, it is an interesting question, because let's just think about the World Wide Web, for instance. I started my own PhD research about mobile web at the time where, as I was saying at the very beginning, where, let's say, mobile telecoms companies and some of the handset vendors had very different kinds of ideas what the mobile web should be like. Yeah, it should be actually, the initial idea was that it would be something separate from the big web, controlled proprietary standards and controlled by certain specific industry subsets. It didn't go like this because of the other kinds of stakeholders who are interested in publishing widely, publishing in all platforms in a relatively similar way. Yeah? So we ended up at this open multi-platform, device-agnostic web as a result. Also, if you remember, there were browser wars just a little bit before the mobile web came along. So again, kind of, and our web was almost breaking. Yeah. So it was a point in time that you needed to design your website for the Microsoft Explorer. And it didn't work on other things, etc. It was a long thing, big thing. So I wonder, I think it is because of these kinds of questions, similarities, that I'm wondering about this kind of, are we getting into some closed words, some dependencies? Are we limited in various ways thus? And I guess the word that I've been discovering is, as I said, I ventured to the field to simply figure it out in some sense. And what I've been discovering is this actually quite a much more chaotic process. That the world is patchy, it's relatively unstandardized, there are relatively unclear but there are some motivations to move towards this kind of the open systems, yeah? And they, as I said, as I laid it out, they are somewhat different. Yeah, so it happens for actually quite different reasons why different institutions are moving towards these things, which may result that there is a certain convergence, but of course the convergence won't be absolute. So as I said, even the EPU core is adopted and then adapted in different ways. And I guess as data scientists, as scientists, as also citizens, we just need to be aware of this, what is happening. And as I said at the beginning, my hunch was right. We should look at the metadata really carefully. Where is it coming from? As the title is saying, instead of just saying, having this idea of the magnificent platforms, all powerful, with the very clever algorithms ruining our lives, which I can tell you is not the case.
Nice. Thank you very much. You basically brought a pointer and a justification here that we actually need to study multi-goal evolution in the chaotic world. Mila, you have it's sort of the second to last question, I think.
Okay, so I have maybe second time during this conversation. I think that you have been already discussing what I'm asking, but I'm still kind of like, I want to ask, because I think it's very interesting how you mentioned that we are probably not ever going to have kind of like one standard for, I don't know, for audiovisual media or such things. And you talk about path dependencies, how they kind of like are affecting there. And then you mentioned also that, of course, like different actors or kind of like different media actors, such as like the archives or broadcasters or the industry, they have different kinds of motivations there. So do you think, what is the kind of like and if we think more in more general about these kind of like standardization processes and such, what do you think, what is your hunch, what is the more kind of like decisive kind of like force behind this? Is it kind of like the path dependencies and the kind of like the metadata standards or such things that were acquired previously, or is it more in the different kinds of motivations that kind of like set the obstacles for developing these kinds of like common metadata standards?
Okay, yeah, I'm very good that we are having these discussions because it provokes my own thinking also. So here comes in actually, of course, we have our own path dependencies, so my own previous work. And so as you know, I'm part genetician, and so Partin has this idea of centrifugal and centripetal systems and Lotman kind of adopted this a little. So the argument being that two universal systems are not good for describing specificities, yeah? And then two fragmented systems are bad because subsystems cannot communicate, and there's a mess. And in some sense, actually in the context of my own PhD work, I made the same argument that there was a need to move towards one universal web space, standardized in a uniform way. But then let's say the content makers, the content providers needed specifications, needed to be able to communicate their own things, and that's certain variety was kind of allowed in the system in a way. And I think I don't know if I'm speaking too long, and I may have also already kind of forgot your question, but the point is that I think it's entirely important that there's a differentiation in standards as well, because all standards serve a specific descriptive descriptive function. So, and in some sense, as it is in culture, diversity is important. because language diversity enables different kinds of viewpoints. But at the same time, there needs to be infrastructure. There needs to be a way to transfer, to communicate between these subsystems, different. Yeah. So in this sense, standardization also globally is important, and as well as keep this important national difference. Because when I answered your previous question about national specificities and these institutional specific setups, institutional specific setups are also expressions of national culture, of certain national difference, and thus they matter. But yeah, I guess I've already answered your question, everything what I have to say in this context, that both are important. I don't know.
Nice. I'd like to thank everybody for this really invigorating discussion. So we spent 2 hours. There's like 1 minute left. I'd like to close with an anecdote. Last week, I came across in the Quarian book, classic computer architecture by Hennessy and Hutchison. And what I always do, I look at like the latest version. And so there's a 6th edition from 2017, which ends in the appendix that there is now data centers in a box. So basically, high performance compute infrastructure can be put into a shipping container. And one of the applications of that is putting the entire Internet Archive into a 20-foot container. That's now where it resides. The standard place where you would find the Internet Archive in different mirrors on the world is in a 20-foot shipping container. So everything fits into one container. The question is obviously how standardized this is, what kind of metadata standard there should be. As you all know, they have addresses of movies and stuff in there. But I think there's also something tragic in there, which is only one person is needed to pull the plug. And so I think that is something which, I almost think this is, I personally find this like half spiritual. I'm sort of happy that there is not one universal standard, because you only need one disease to destroy the system. And so there is always some beauty in like approaching things in different ways. But nevertheless, the discussion won't go away because some standard is useful. And so I'd like to thank again Indrek for giving us this very inspiring sort of like update on his own work, and also I hope inspiration for everyone in CUDAN and everybody outside to think about these issues. And while looking at data, I'd like to remind everybody the standards, they may be boring, they are very important to take into account, because if you don't know what kind of standards or assumptions of standard are behind them, we cannot understand them. So yeah, thank you very much. See you next week.